Welcome to the Curious Platypus. I'm Michael Edward, and today's piece is titled The Chronic Pain Series, Part 2. It was a rather brisk Saturday morning in August of 2020. I was standing on my workbench in the bathroom of a friend's house. For some silly reason, I'd agreed to help this guy redo his bathroom ceiling after his place had sprung a leak. That was the first lesson this 2-year ordeal taught me. Never agree to help someone on a Saturday. The friend of a friend in question had left the room to answer a call, leaving me to fight with the decorative cornice that seemed hell-bent on sliding down the newly tiled walls of this cramped bathroom. A few nails would have held the uncooperative cornice in place. Nails I could have hit in with my hammer, but my hammer was in my tool belt, and I definitely wasn't wearing that, was I? Of course not. Only conscientious ceiling fixers wore their tool belts while working, and I certainly wasn't one of them. Oh no. I was more of what you might call a cowboy. My renegade ways meant that I had to let go of the teetering piece of cornice so that I could get off my bench, put on my tool belt, and get back to the cornice before it and the wet plaster that lined the back of it fell to the floor. It was bending down to grab my tool belt that did it. I hadn't even reached it when, ping, ping, pop! The initial shock felt like taking a step only to find there's nothing there for your foot to land on. And the initial pain felt like that split second where you realize you've stubbed your toe, but the intensity of what's about to hit you hasn't fully registered yet. Then, my entire low back constricted. Instantly, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it was. As I cautiously tried to straighten my torso, my back assured me that it was, in fact, really bad. I'd lost all range of motion. I tried to take a step towards my bench to sit down as 1,000 knives plunged into my spine. As I tried again to take a step, I suddenly understood how it felt to be wrapped up in the death grip of an anaconda. My back muscles were constricting so intensely that breathing became painful. With the knives twisting and the anaconda squeezing, I said, "Fuck, this is not good," right as the decorative piece of cornice fell to the floor, splattering plaster all over my legs. What happened next is a blur. I remember the concerned look on the face of the female pharmacist as I staggered into the chemist like the hunchback of Notre Dame. I remember the wounded yelps that escaped my mouth every time I had to push in my clutch to change gears. And I remember literally crawling on my hands and knees up the stairs of my apartment block. I spent the next 5 days in bed, in utter agony and completely immobile. And I'm not being hyperbolic. I mean, I apologize if this is too much information, but I was so incapacitated that I pissed into bottles on those first 5 days because staggering to the toilet seemed inconceivable. On day 6, my back loosened up enough that I could grimace my way to the toilet. On day 9, I started to regain some semblance of mobility and the pain began to subside. And by the 2-week mark, my back had returned to normal, and I had no more pain. And since I was a doctor-avoiding idiot, I wrote that incident off as some random event and got back to life as normal. That is, until it happened again a few weeks later. The second time was worse. If the last time it was knives and an anaconda, then this time it was flaming swords and some primordial leviathan. If last time the tightness rendered me incapacitated, then this time it turned me to stone. And if last time I pissed into bottles, well, you don't even want to know what I did this time. But the truly disconcerting thing about the second time was that I wasn't even bending down to pick something up. In fact, if you must know, I was standing up after sitting on the toilet. That's it. I hadn't had some big fall on my skateboard. I hadn't been trying to pick up something heavy at work. I hadn't been tearing through some wicked move on the dance floor. I'd been getting up off the fucking toilet. I found this more concerning than if I had suffered some obvious physical trauma. I mean, I was 29, not 89. Surely I had a few good years left in me before seemingly innocuous movements caused me to throw out my back. You'd think the level of pain those two incidents caused, coupled with the mysterious origins that triggered them, would have been enough for me to go see a doctor, right? Ha! Come on. I was far too pig-headed for that. Instead, I chose to do what I always did. Ignore the problem. Push through the pain. And carry on as normal as if this mounting issue didn't exist. Ah, avoidance, my old friend. What ridiculous adventures we've had together. Considering how silly it was for me to eschew medical assistance, I feel I should begin to unpack some of the unhelpful attitudes that informed that decision. For starters, the decade prior I'd worked full-time as a tradesman, leaving that work behind only 6 months earlier to go study at university. In the simplest of terms, this means that for 10 years I was firmly entrenched in male-dominated work environments. Cat calls were yelled from scaffolds, good-natured shit-stirring mirrored schoolyard bullying, and the pansies that couldn't hack it bore the worst of the torment. Now, I'm not about to paint male-centered environments in a completely black and white way, because there were also a lot of hard-working, no-nonsense men who didn't partake in any of that garbage. However, I am comfortable claiming that there was not much nuance when it came to toughing it out to get the work done. Nearly every guy I worked with, especially the guys over 40, had some chronic work-related injury that they'd been battling for years. Compression bandages on elbows and knees were just as common as nudie mags in the site toilets. Painkillers and anti-inflammatories were downed on smoker with more frequency than the free cups of Stow instant coffee. This is one of the less acknowledged parts of many male work environments. 90% of those bastards are pushing through physical pain on a daily basis. And if you spend 10 years in such a culture, you start to absorb these attitudes to the point where ignoring your back pain becomes normal. And then there's skateboarding. I'm biased when it comes to skateboarding, as that plank of wood has enriched my life in innumerable ways, but that doesn't mean I can't acknowledge its downsides. After all, this is an activity where failure results in collisions with concrete. To skateboard is to become accustomed to pain. It's to fight a losing battle against gravity, asphalt, and accumulative injuries. And skateboard culture knows this. And in some weird and disconcerting way, there are sects of it that even glorify it. Skate culture has a special place in its heart for the professionals who put themselves through untold pain to progress their field. We revere the Tony Hawks and Danny Ways of the world not just for the death-defying feats that they perform, but also their willingness to bear the physical toll that comes from performing such feats. And on one level, we should celebrate these skateboarders, as it's inspiring to see people give so much of themselves to the thing they love. But on another level, such celebrations can also lead impressionable young skaters, me, to gobble up all that romantic nonsense about destroying yourself for your art. And if these impressionable young skaters aren't careful, then the destructive attitudes they've adopted can quickly see them ignoring their back issue, as they think such behavior is normal. Given that I'd adopted such deleterious attitudes, it will probably come as no surprise that over the next few months I continued to ignore my back pain. So much so that I subjected myself to 5 more bouts of bed-ridden agony before I acknowledged there was a problem. And by then, there really was a problem. On top of the muscle spasms that rendered me incapacitated for a week every time I committed the sin of moving, my back had now begun to ache all the time. The ache wasn't as intense as the spasms, nor did it leave me completely immobile. It was, however, absolutely relentless. It kept me awake, it made it impossible to focus, and very quickly it started to drive me nuts. It wasn't just that the pain bothered me, it was that there was no moment of reprieve. It just kept tormenting me incessantly, no matter what position I was in, no matter how many heat packs I applied, no matter how many anti inflammatories I consumed, no matter what the fuck I did, I couldn't escape the nagging pain that gnawed at my back. And so, finally, off to the doctors I hobbled. To be continued.